My name is Rachel Schnalzer. I'm a video research associate at BuzzFeed. So that essentially means my team and I are responsible for ensuring that BuzzFeed videos are up to high journalistic standards of accuracy. We do a lot of fact checking, we do a lot of copy checking to make sure everything is well worded, grammatically correct, etc. I really enjoy my position. Prior to this, I worked at Snapchat on their news content team, and I curated stories about local news in Chicago, Los Angeles, and then did more specialized stories about, for example, the Brexit vote or wildlife preservation in Los Angeles. In my free time, I am enjoying learning from the Center for Media Literacy. I enjoy putting together some classes for the Santa Monica Public Library, and the first class will be in November 2018. So that's a little bit about me. And we're here to discuss you, Professor Henry Jenkins. So would you mind telling us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. I'm the Provost Professor of Communication, Journalism, Cinematic Art, and Education at the University of Southern California, or as I like to say, Professor of Miscellaneous Studies, because that title is quite the mouthful. But it does describe the kind of work that I do. I work at intersections. Media is at the center for me. It's what I understand. I'm interested in pop culture and its relationship to everyday life and a changing world. But I'm interested in the intersection of media, journalism, politics, education, all those things brought together. I've done now 19 books,
Wow.
2 new ones sent off this summer. And those books go from books on vaudeville and early screen comedy to recent book coming out next year on graphic novels, and a number of pieces on everyday people's relationship to media, textual poachers, convergence culture, spreadable media, reading in a participatory culture in a networked era, and now the most recent, By Any Media Necessary, New Youth Activism. So media literacy is something I've been very involved with since MacArthur launched its Digital Media and Learning Initiative more than a decade ago, and I've continued to be engaged with it throughout that period of time. I have a podcast, How Do You Like It So Far, where we talk to guests every week about some aspect of pop culture in a changing society. We see that as a really good resource for media literacy teachers.
So we're here to discuss youth participation and agency. You mentioned on your About page that, quote, according to the Pew Center for Internet and American Life, more than 60% of American youth have produced media, and a significant portion have distributed that media content online. So I imagine those numbers are also pretty similar amongst young people around the world who are going to be tuning in to this recording. So I'm curious about your opinion. What advice do you have for young people who are passionate about creating media but unsure of how to do it traditionally right, the way, a high school journalist might have? How would a student without access to a high school paper, high school journalism teacher, what are methods that they can learn to participate in media best, in your opinion?
Well, I think, first of all, the new forms of media that are emerging don't always look like those of traditional high school journalism. Mm-hmm. So you want to be engaged with the genres of writing, the genres of media production that are popular within the networks you're working with. Often the online communication of young people is much more immediate, it's much more personal, it's more informal. It may be less rigidly structured than traditional journalism would have been, but it is also making truth claims, right? And so insofar as it's making truth claims, it has to have some sense of accountability. That is, in a world where we all are distributing information, and young people are distributing information, whether they're blogging or podcasting or making YouTube videos or simply passing a news story on through Facebook or Twitter, they're all in the business of circulating information. Many of them are in the business of making it. But in that world, the information we circulate has enormous effects, right? Most young people are getting their information about the world from other young people, framed through social media discourse, and that affects their understanding of the political process, how they act on it, and so forth. In a world of alternative facts and fake news, we want young people to be sure they're right before they pass things along. that's a crucial motto. Make sure you're right and go ahead is sort of the motto, I think, of online communication. Now, that may mean checking things out on websites that are designed to be fact-checker sites. It may mean going back to a source and making sure that it actually is a legitimate news source. Don't pass an Onion article or a Daily Show segment along thinking it's an actual news segment. Be aware what the genre it is and how you frame it for your friends. So that's the first thing. Professional standards of production may be breaking down. We're willing to tolerate kind of informal production practices, what used to be seen as incompetent production practices, bad lighting, slightly off-camera compositions, sort of less than perfect sound recording. We accept it if the voice is immediate, if it's telling us something that matters, if there is a sense of a spark or voice that's emerging through that medium. We're excited to see it, I think, as a society. So don't hesitate on those grounds, but do be careful to think about making sure the information you're circulating is accurate and that the opinions you're expressing are not necessarily going to be hurtful to another human being who's out there and has feelings, which is the other thing we forget when we circulate things online, is that we're talking to actual people, not just computer to computer.
Absolutely. I have definitely found that in both of my positions after college. So at Snapchat, a lot of the news reporting would be a selfie of yourself talking to the camera to explain the context of a protest prior to a campaign rally during the 2016 US election or something like that. It's not going to be perfect. You might stumble over your words a little bit. The sun might be getting in your eyes, but at the end of the day, if the information's accurate, then, and you're hearable, and that's all that really mattered at the end of the day. And I've noticed that at BuzzFeed here as well. So I definitely appreciate that point that you bring up. I'm wondering, do you have any advice for a young person who is looking to create media and really wants it to be correct, wants it to be based in fact? What types of practices do you typically recommend for someone like that?
Well, I think the first thing is not to hit record, finish it, and just throw it up without listening to it yourself.
Right.
And thinking back through what you recorded, because there's often a tendency, and it's so easy and so immediate to put up in an age of social media. We just throw things out, and we're angry and hostile and speaking from the heart, but not necessarily from the head. And I think it's worth pulling back. It's often worth getting a friend or someone else to listen to it or watch it, read it before you actually post it.
Right.
Someone who watch your back and make sure you're not saying stupid things you're going to regret in the morning. Because if you're not drunk tweeting or whatever, those things, all the things. So first of all, pay attention to what the President of the United States is doing and do the exact opposite when it comes to etiquette and ethics in online behavior. We have the worst possible example at the top, so we want to go in the other direction. And one of the things he likes to do is send out media that he doesn't know the sources of, and he gets called out on the sources of and is surprised where that media came from. Another thing he likes to do is sort of make up facts that suit his argument but haven't been fact-checked or verified. There's a tendency for name-calling in Trump's tweets, and that often inflames the situation and creates divisiveness. So these are the kinds of things you want to watch for. We can see Trump's tweets create a reaction among adults. Young people's tweets do the same thing in a school community when they do this. And so they want to think very carefully about what they're saying when they do that. Now, there are online sources like Snopes and some others that are doing fact-checking of common urban myths, but it's often misinformation is emerging so quickly that people don't have time to catch up with it. It's traveling faster than the ability of any fact-checking community to necessarily identify it as important and try to lay the facts out. So you have to use what my colleague calls the sniff test, right? If it smells bad, it probably is bad. It's probably not good. It's the same thing you would do at a grocery store, right? You pick up a piece of fruit and you sniff it to see if it's overripe or may have other problems. So that's what you got to do is develop an intuitive understanding of the space you're trying to comment on, and make sure what you're saying feels right, seems to come from an authoritative source. We all get it wrong sometimes, but if you're consistently doing things that stir up anger and frustration and misinform people and mislead people and result in people taking actions that are not grounded in the truth, again, look to the top, then you're probably not a very ethical or smart user of the internet.
And it seems to me that, you know, young people learning these skills today are really going to be the models for the future because, you know, like we were just saying, the adults in the room, most of them aren't practicing, you know, the correct practices as far as media literacy goes. So it's kind of an exciting time for young people to utilize media literacy and set a great example moving forward.
Yeah, I think we discovered that young people have been on the cutting edge of a large number of media throughout history. So we could go back to the toy printing press movement of the 19th century, where young people were using toy printing presses to print we now call zines, and sharing them across the U.S. in like the 1860s.
Right.
We could go back to the first use of radio as an interactive form in the early 20th century, when Boy Scout troops and schools and church groups and young people in their basement were using media technology. So we look throughout history, young people are always on the cutting edge of media. They're often looking for media that they can use to connect with friends over longer distance, that they can communicate outside of tight adult control, that they can find their voice and express their place in the world. And we're at another one of those moments where young people will be the leaders of what media emerges, including what are the ethics of media. And I see young people potentially, as they work through flame wars online, offering us a model for what adult political communication could look like if we move beyond the fixed positions, say, the political parties lock people into, and into a place where we could actually listen to each other, collaborate with each other, use a word that cropped up rather a lot yesterday in the hearings you were talking about. Collaborate is a very different model than the personal destruction, seek and destroy, that people were describing in the U.S. Senate's response to the Supreme Court nominee.
Absolutely. I found that it's interesting how in both workplaces that I've worked at so far, you know, at Snapchat, we created content, but at the end of the day, it was a participatory app. That's what Snapchat is. You send videos of yourself or something you find amusing or entertaining or informative to your friends. So at the end of the day, that was really the core of why people were using the app, in my opinion. So it was interesting to it was humbling, you know, as a content creator to take a step back, like, look, I'm producing something, but at the end of the day, our users, who are oftentimes young people, are really the producers and participants in this model. Similar to BuzzFeed to a certain extent, you know, we have a community feature where people can create their own content. So it's interesting to see even mediums start to recognize this and kind of give the keys over to people who want to create their own content.
Yeah, the quality of your media content is the quality of the community that organizes around it.
Right.
The quality of the conversations it generates. And I think more and more creators are getting that and understanding what that might mean. And we've mostly been using American examples so far, and I realize we're speaking in international context, but this is a story we're hearing again and again from around the world. I did an interview this week for an upcoming podcast episode with someone from Orb Media, and they just released a report called Generation Activism that had thousands of interviews of young activists and citizens around the world, 60 countries represented, and they were finding that young people were using social media as their primary political outlet, that many young people were less likely to vote than their parents had, but deeply engaged in the world because they were bringing issues to each other's attention through social media, and that they were more likely to take to the streets and be mobilized in activist campaigns in countries all over the world. And this was true right and left, America, Europe, Asia, Africa. Young people everywhere are following similar practices to the ones that we're talking about.
Absolutely. And I was actually hoping to turn the conversation to some activism around the world. So I'm wondering if you can kind of speak to ways in which you expect in the next 10, I'm going to rephrase this question for the recording.
Okay.
So what are some of the ways that you expect social media activism to change over the next 10 years across the world? What are some of the avenues that you expect young people are going to be taking?
Well, I would start by the fact that we call our book By Any Media Necessary. So we often discuss this as social media activism. I would reverse that and say it's activism conducted through social media, because what we heard from young activists when we were doing that research was that they're using whatever platforms are available to them. It could be the school newspaper, except school newspapers are often censored around the world. It could be taking to the streets, except in many parts of the world there are regulations about young people, curfews, regulations about public assemblies, and so forth. It could be making comics or creating posters and pasting them on the wall or doing graffiti. All of those are part of the modern repertoire. So if we look at, say, again, I'm going to use an American example because I know it well. You look at the Parkland youth who organized about gun control, what's called the Never Again campaign. They really, everything from Emma Gonzalez's jacket with the patches on it that represent different causes she's engaged with and symbolize the intersectionality, the connections of her across a variety of different identity groups and messages, to social media, to their ability to appear on CNN or another news outlet and really get their messages across, to the use of theatrical performance and musical performances during the Tony Awards. They have filled into every space to get their message out to the world. And that's what I think we're going to see. So the media systems of different countries may differ significantly. I'll use the example of Brazil here, which is a country I've spent a fair amount of time with. So you can imagine a media system that might use social media, but also could use graffiti, because street art is very big in Brazil, songwriters and performers on the streets, another phenomenon of Brazil, the carnival culture of Brazil, which is about public performances and public gatherings, even the sand sculpture that you see on the beaches at Rio and elsewhere in that country, which is often used to stage things, right? There was a whole Star Wars display on the beach in Rio when I was there a few years back, and someone would tell you the story of Star Wars for money as you stood in front of his sand sculpture. That's a communication system.
Right.
So we're going to see young people make social change by whatever media necessary. Now, the trends in social media is that it's much easier to organize and mobilize than ever before. And again, these high school students organized after the shooting at Parkland have demonstrated a capacity to move rapidly through social media to rally high school students across the United States to walk out of classes at the same time, coordinated effort and protest, to get people first to the capital of the state of Florida, where they were from, and then to the nation's capital in record amount of time by their ability to connect quickly and efficiently through social media. And we saw similar things around the Arab Spring. We've seen similar things in protest movements across Europe. Young people are taking the lead through those forums. And in the case of the Parkland youth, young people who are not yet old enough to vote, but are out there getting people to register to vote and advocating that people vote on their behalf when the next election comes out. And these would have been people who wouldn't have been thought of as political agents at all.
Right.
In another generation, right? They wouldn't have been allowed to speak and wouldn't have been heard. The other thing is that they're living in an increasingly global society. So we often hear from news agencies, oh, foreign affairs doesn't get read in the United States and many other parts of the world. It's not interesting to people, particularly young people. And my first response is that's because you're calling it foreign affairs.
Yeah.
The young people live in a global society. They go to multicultural schools, they're online fan communities, bring them in contact with people around the world. They have firsthand stories of things in the world that affect them. But those stories need to be told in a way that shows the connections across countries, not simply a focus on the national, and seeing everything else as foreign is not a helpful way of connecting young people to the political world. So social media often adjusts for that. It says, you know, Jimmy comes from Ethiopia, looks what's going on there, is a way of bridging through a Facebook post between a news story and the people that you know in your own community who may be affected by that coverage. And that's one reason why I think young people value news spread through social media more than reading the newspaper or watching television news.
Can you anticipate any of the ways in which you think new media and social media will change in the next 10 years or so?
Well, I think I don't know how the change is going to come about, but very clearly, the social media networks are under real pressure over the fake news phenomenon, right? And that's one of the really battlegrounds right now. We're starting to see conspiracy theory content being taken down. We're starting to see more of an effort to police the role of bots in social media that may often spread antagonistic and false information. We're starting to see people root out hackers and others who are intentionally producing fake news in order to gain eyeballs that then get them advertising revenue and so forth. So the last election in the U.S., the top read news stories on the election, most of them were fake news, not legitimate news from the New York Times and Washington Post and Wall Street Journal and so forth. That tension is brewing here. We're seeing the attention to the roles of Soviet hacking of the American election, but also suggestions that the Soviets were not the only one hacking our election, and ours was not the only election that has been hacked. And so all of that is going to put pressure on Facebook, Twitter, other social media platforms to police themselves more carefully. Now, as that happens, we've got to make hope that some of the free speech aspects that are valued in those forums don't get lost in the process. Once you go too aggressively at reading out and getting rid of hate speech, say, or fake information, then you get the things that people legitimately believe and want to communicate. And we need to figure out what our zone of tolerance is. I think what we're looking at is a world where historically the public had very little access to the capacity to reproduce their ideas. Right? We had freedom of the press as long as you could afford to buy a newspaper press.
Right.
Right now we live in a world where most people have access to channels of communication that allow them to spread messages. They're not equal opportunities, but there's at least the opportunity to put something out there and be heard. But we're not raised with the ethical responsibilities that journalists have historically been trained in. We don't always think about the consequences of our communication. There's often the sense of unexpected audiences, of digital, aftershocks, of news spread, context collapse. People will call it a variety of things, but something you post to your friends gets picked up and carried to new contacts and has consequences you never anticipated before, and may bring down a lot of unwanted attention on you as a result of that. And so I think those are the struggles we're working through. I don't know what the solution to those things are, because there's core tensions with all of that between maintaining the ability of everyone to participate, everyone to find their voice, everyone to get their ideas out there, and the sense of creating a safe space, ensuring the accuracy of information, ensuring some civility in communication, and protecting the identity of people who need to communicate things which put them at risk, right? And that's an important part of the new communication environment as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I want to say the answer is media literacy tools, but at the same time, it needs to, like our favorite word, collaborative. We have to have a collaborative approach to even that, because like we discussed earlier, we as adults and young people each have a lot to learn from one another. So it seems to me that that's the best answer.
Well, I definitely think collaborate is the key idea at the moment. Negotiate may be another one. And listening to each other, respect, is a key part of that. So
Right.
Part of what's broken down is we've extended the scale of communication so rapidly that norms haven't kept pace. The sense of what's the right way to communicate with someone else isn't there. And often out of ignorance, we say very hurtful things to each other. And I think that's part of what we've got to figure out as well, is think through, make sure you're right and go ahead, as my motto goes, but think it through before you throw it out into the world, because it can have very large scale effects.
Absolutely. So for the last 3 minutes, I'm just wondering if there's a question that you wish I would have asked you.
Probably not, but I think I'm excited at the opportunity to be speaking to the audience that's going to be gathered in Riga. I think it's an exciting, meeting of people. I wish I could be there in person. It's a place I've always wanted to go to, and hopefully we'll get to very soon. Because I think incredible things are happening across the Baltics and Eastern Europe more broadly. I've been lucky enough to visit Czech Republic, Romania, Hungary, Poland, and I know Poles have consistently translated my works into their language. That there's a Czech translation of Textual Poachers that's just about to come out there, and I think I really love the responses I get from people across the eastern part of Europe in the ways they reflect on these issues of change. They're affecting their lives as much as ours. If anything, even more dramatically in a post-socialist world, given the changes economically, politically, culturally, socially that those countries are already been undergoing over the last few decades. The social media has crucial roles to play in how they respond to that process of change.
Absolutely. I'd also like to extend a big thanks to UNESCO for having us, and hope that everyone at the conference enjoys our conversation and engages with us further online and elsewhere.
Yeah, so check out the blog, henryjenkins.org, and the podcast, How Do You Like It So Far, if you want to hear more of my ideas about media and social change.
Great. That was awesome. Thank you so much.